She didn't scream. That was the first thing that saved her. Mara Ellison had learned a long time ago that screaming told people exactly where you were. So when she cut through the parking garage on 9th and heard footsteps behind her, heavy, unhurried, the kind of footsteps that belonged to men who knew you couldn't outrun them and didn't need to try, she didn't scream. She ran, her sneakers slapped against concrete slick with rain. Level 2 of the garage was mostly empty, just a scatter of cars under buzzing fluorescent lights, half of them flickering like they were thinking about giving up. She'd taken this shortcut 100 times. Tonight it felt like a trap she'd built for herself. Mara, the voice from behind her, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You're making this difficult. That was Denny. Denny worked for Roman, and Roman was the man her ex-fiancé owed $40,000 to, and somehow through a logic she still didn't fully understand that debt had become her problem the moment she'd left him standing at an altar 6 months ago, with 300 confused guests and a caterer he never paid. She hadn't taken his money. She hadn't taken anything. She'd taken herself, which apparently counted as theft to men like Roman. She turned down a row of cars, breath tearing out of her in ragged clouds. There, a black car, long and low, parked at an angle like whoever left it hadn't cared about the lines. Tinted windows. Unlocked. Please be unlocked, she thought, and grabbed the back door handle without breaking stride. It opened. She didn't think. She folded herself into the back seat, pulled the door shut as quiet as she could, and dropped below the window line, curling into the footwell with her knees against her chest and her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Denny's footsteps passed. Slowed. Stopped. For one long, horrible second, close enough that she could hear him breathing. Then, they kept going, further down the row, and she let out a breath so shaky it barely counted as one. She stayed there for what felt like 10 minutes. Maybe it was 3. Time did strange things when you were folded into a stranger's footwell, listening for the sound of your own murder. Eventually she decided it was safe enough to sit up, just enough to see out the window, plan her next move, figure out where the nearest open store was, somewhere with people, somewhere Denny wouldn't the engine started. She froze. It wasn't the click of a key. It was smoother than that. A low hum like the car had been waiting for a reason to wake up, and then it began to move, pulling out of the space with the kind of unhurried confidence that told her whoever was driving had absolutely no idea there was a woman hiding on the floor behind them. Mara's mind did the math very quickly and did not like the answer. She had 2 choices. She could sit up right now, announce herself, and hope the driver was a reasonable person who wouldn't call the police the second a stranger popped up out of nowhere in the back of their car. Or she could stay very, very still, wait until the car stopped somewhere with people around, and slip out before anyone noticed. She chose option 2, which in hindsight was the first mistake in a night that was going to be full of them. The car turned left. Then, right. The streetlight sliding past the window went from orange to something colder, a kind of pale blue-white she didn't recognize from this part of the city. She kept her head down, pressed against the seat, and tried to breathe through her mouth so it wouldn't be as loud. That was when she noticed the temperature. The car was cold, not air-conditioned cold. Actually cold. The kind of cold that made the hair on her arms stand up. The kind that didn't belong in a car with a working heater and a driver presumably alive enough to want one. She shifted, just slightly, to get a better angle on the front seat, and that was when she saw his hand on the wheel. Long fingers. Pale, in a way that wasn't quite pale skin paler, like something that had never really seen daylight. Still, too still. A hand at 10 and 2 that didn't drum against the wheel or shift or do any of the small restless things hands did when their owner was thinking about traffic or music or dinner. She realized, with a slow and creeping dread, that she had not heard him breathe once. Not once. Not the whole ride. "You can stop holding your breath," he said without turning around, in a voice that was low and even and entirely unbothered. "I heard your heart rate change 3 streets ago. If you were going to attack me, you'd have done it by now." Mara did not move. She weighed the merits of pretending to be asleep, decided it was a stupid plan, and sat up slowly with her hands where he could see them, because some instinct older than logic told her that was the smart thing to do. "I'm not going to attack you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was hiding from someone. I didn't know the car was occupied. Clearly, I'll get out at the next light." "You could," he agreed. "Or you could tell me who you were hiding from," since he seemed determined enough to walk the entire second level of a parking garage looking for you, and I'd rather not have found a body in my back seat by accident. She looked at the rearview mirror, trying to catch his eyes, and found only shadow where his face should have been reflected. A strange absence that made her stomach drop somewhere lower than her shoes. "What are you?" she said, before she could stop herself. For the first time since she'd sat up, he turned his head not far, just enough that she caught the edge of his profile against the passing streetlights. Pale eyes. Too still. A face that looked young and impossibly old in the same breath. The kind of face that made you feel like you were looking at a photograph of someone, rather than an actual person sitting 3 feet away. "That," he said, "is a longer conversation than the one we're currently having. Who was chasing you?" Mara swallowed. Somewhere behind her, 6 blocks away now. Denny was probably calling Roman to say he'd lost her. Somewhere in front of her, a man who didn't breathe was driving her through a part of the city she didn't recognize, toward a destination she had absolutely no say in. She'd escaped one trap. She was starting to suspect she'd climbed straight into another one. "His name's Denny," she said finally. "He works for a man named Roman. It's a long story." "I have time," the driver said. "I have a great deal of time, actually, more than you'd believe." She hadn't meant to tell him everything, but somehow, in the strange quiet of that too-cold car, it came out in pieces anyway. Her engagement to a man named Callum, who she'd thought was ambitious, and turned out to be reckless. The $40,000 he'd borrowed from a man he called an investor, and everyone else called Roman. The wedding she'd walked out of, not because of the debt she hadn't even known about it then, but because she'd found 3 other women's numbers saved in his phone under names like work contact and delivery guy. The debt had come knocking 2 weeks later, and Roman's people had decided that since Callum had conveniently disappeared, she was the next best thing to collect from. "So you left him at the altar," the driver said, "and inherited his debts as a parting gift." When you say it like that, it sounds almost funny. It isn't funny. It's efficient cruelty. Men like that rarely think about who's left holding what they drop. She studied the back of his head, the dark hair a little too neat, like it had been arranged rather than grown. "You keep saying things like you've met men like Callum before. A lot of them. I've had 800 years to meet several varieties of coward," he said simply, and let the silence after that sentence do the explaining, because apparently that was as far as he was willing to go for now. Mara laughed. It came out thin and slightly hysterical, the laugh of someone whose night had already exceeded her capacity for surprises. 800 years. "Right, sure, you don't believe me. I believe you're cold. I believe you don't breathe when you talk, which is genuinely unsettling, by the way. I believe your car feels like a walk-in freezer. I don't believe you're 800 years old, because that's not a thing that happens to people. I didn't say I was a person," he said, and turned the wheel smoothly onto a street she didn't recognize, lined with buildings that looked older than anything downtown had a right to be. Ivy climbing black iron gates, street lamps that burned a shade of blue-white she now understood wasn't a trick of her tired eyes. The car slowed in front of a gate that opened before he'd even fully stopped, like it had been waiting for him, like everything here was waiting for him. "Where are we?" she asked, and heard the edge of fear creep back into her voice. "Somewhere Roman's men have never once set foot," he said. "Somewhere you'll be safe until we decide what to do about Denny, and about the man he answers to." "We?" He finally looked at her fully in the mirror, and this time she could see his eyes pale gray, almost silver, catching the passing light like a coin flipped in the dark. "You climbed into my car uninvited, Miss Ellison. That makes you, unfortunately, my responsibility now. I don't take that lightly. You know my name. You told Denny's men your name when you argued with Callum outside the church. I have very good hearing. That was months ago. I have a very good memory as well." The car rolled through the gate and up a long drive lined with trees so old their branches met overhead like a cathedral ceiling, and Mara sat very still in the back seat of a car driven by a man who didn't breathe, trying to decide if she'd just been rescued or simply relocated to a more elaborate cage. "I need you to understand something," she said, before he could pull to a stop. "I don't know you. I don't know what you are, exactly, though I have some very alarming guesses. And I have spent the last 6 months learning the hard way what happens when I trust the wrong man with my life. So whatever this place is, whatever you are, I'm not staying if I don't want to." He did stop the car then, in front of a house that looked less like a house and more like something out of a book she'd read as a child, all dark stone and high windows, and turned fully around in his seat to look at her, no longer hiding behind the mirror. His face, up close, was almost unbearably still, not stiff, not frozen, just quiet in a way human faces rarely were, like he'd spent centuries learning to hold his expressions close and only let them show when he meant them. "My name is Adrian," he said. "I am, as you've likely gathered, not human, and haven't been for a very long time. I did not bring you here to keep you. I brought you here because a man named Denny is hunting a woman through a city at night over a debt that was never hers, and I find that I object to it, on principle and for reasons I haven't fully examined yet. You may leave whenever you wish. I will, however, ask you to consider staying at least until morning, because Roman's men do not give up as easily as you'd like, and I would rather not read about your name in tomorrow's obituaries." Mara stared at him. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, the terror of being chased through a parking garage had curdled into something stranger, not exactly safety, but a kind of suspended disbelief, the sense of having stepped sideways out of her actual life into someone else's much stranger one. "Adrian," she repeated, testing the name like she was checking it for hidden edges. "Okay, Adrian. If I stay the night, I want a door that locks from my side, and a real explanation about what you are, because not human is not an answer. It's a dodge." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to be its ancestor. "Fair terms," he said. "I can offer both." He got out of the car, moving around to open her door before she'd even reached for the handle, and held out a hand she didn't take. Not yet, though she noticed filed away. The way you notice small facts when your life has gone strange around the edges, that his hand, held out in the cool night air, was steady in a way that made her own hands, still trembling faintly from adrenaline, feel very human and very breakable by comparison. "After you, Miss Ellison," he said, and she stepped out of the car into a night that had stopped making sense hours ago and hadn't finished yet. Adrian led her through a front hall lit by candlelight that flickered without any draft to explain it, past a staircase wide enough for 6 people to climb shoulder to shoulder, and into a sitting room where a fire burned low and steady in a hearth taller than she was. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, You're shaking. I just climbed into a stranger's car to escape a man who wanted to break my kneecaps for a debt I never signed for, Mara said, lowering herself onto a couch that was older than her grandmother and somehow more comfortable than anything she owned. Shaking feels appropriate. That's fair. He moved to a cabinet, poured something amber into a glass, and handed it to her without asking if she wanted it, which she found she didn't mind, because her hands needed something to hold. You're not drinking, she said, nodding at the empty space where his own glass should have been. I don't need to. Food and drink are pleasantries. For me, habits I keep more out of nostalgia than necessity. He sat across from her, folding himself into a chair, with the unhurried grace of someone who had never once worried about being late for anything, ever, in 8 centuries. Tell me about Roman. She turned the glass in her hands, watching the firelight bend through it. He runs I don't even know what to call it. A lending operation, except the loans aren't legal and the interest isn't measured in percentages. Callum borrowed from him to cover gambling debts. I didn't find out until after I left. Roman's men showed up at my apartment a week later, very polite, very clear that the money was owed by the household. And since Callum had vanished, the household was apparently just me now. And Denny's the one who does the collecting. He's not violent exactly, he's worse. He's patient. He shows up. He waits outside my work. He sends flowers with notes about interest rates. Tonight was the first time he actually chased me. Adrian's jaw tightened, just slightly, a small motion she might have missed if she hadn't spent the last 20 minutes cataloging every micro-expression on his unnervingly still face. Escalation, he said. That usually means someone above him has run out of patience. Great. Comforting. I didn't say it to comfort you. I said it because it's useful to know. He studied her for a long moment. You should sleep. There's a room upstairs. Second door on the left, and yes, it locks from your side. Tomorrow, we'll discuss what to do about Roman. We, she said again, testing the word like she had in the car. You keep saying that like it's already decided. It is, he said simply. I decided it's somewhere around the parking garage. I find I don't enjoy revisiting decisions once I've made them. She wanted to argue, mostly on principle, but the couch was warm and the fire was steady, and her body had apparently decided that adrenaline could only carry a person so far before it cashed out entirely into exhaustion. Fine, she muttered. One night, and in the morning you're explaining the 800 years thing properly, not in riddles. Properly, he agreed, and something in his voice suggested he found the promise more amusing than the situation should have allowed. The room upstairs was simple compared to the rest of the house: a bed, a window overlooking the dark tree line, a lock on the door exactly where he'd promised. She turned it before she even took off her shoes, then sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, finally, to shake properly, the way she hadn't let herself in the car, in front of him. She didn't remember falling asleep. She remembered dreaming of Denny's footsteps, slow and unhurried, and waking somewhere near dawn to find the fear had quieted into something duller, more manageable, the kind of fear you could function around instead of drown in. Downstairs, she found Adrian exactly where she'd left him, as though he hadn't moved all night, which she suspected might actually be true. Did you sleep? She asked. I don't sleep. Not the way you mean. He gestured to a small table where breakfast had appeared: toast, coffee, fruit, arranged with a precision that made her think of someone who'd studied what breakfast was supposed to look like without ever having eaten one. I had it brought up. I wasn't sure what you'd want. You don't eat, but you know how to set a table for someone who does. I've had time to observe. He said it simply, without self-pity, but something in the phrasing made her pause over her coffee. How long, exactly? 800 years, you said. What were you before? She gestured vaguely at him, at the stillness, at the cold that radiated faintly even now, across the table. Before this. Human, he said. Once, a long time ago, in a country that doesn't share a name with what it's called now. I don't remember all of it. Some things fade, even for us. But I remember enough to know I was not always what you see. Do you miss it? Being human? He considered the question with a seriousness that told her no one had asked it in a very long time. I miss the parts I remember, he said finally. Warmth, hunger, the kind that means dinner and not something else. I don't miss the fear. Humans spend so much of their lives afraid, of debts and deadlines and men like Roman. I don't have that anymore. I gave up quite a lot to gain that particular freedom. That sounds lonely. It is, he said without embellishment, like a fact rather than a confession. But loneliness is a small price for not being afraid. Mara turned her coffee cup slowly, on its saucer, thinking about Colum, about the wedding, about the 6 months of low-grade dread that had followed her out of that church and never quite let go. I used to think I wasn't afraid of anything either, she said. Turns out I was afraid of everything. I just called it being careful, so it sounded better. Something shifted in Adrian's expression, not quite warmth, because she wasn't sure his face made warmth the way other faces did, but something adjacent to it, a kind of attention that felt different from the polite curiosity of the night before. We should discuss Roman, he said, and the moment folded itself back into practicality, though she noticed he didn't look away from her quite as quickly as he had the night before. Tell me everything you know about him, Adrian said. Not what Denny told you, what you've actually seen. Mara set down her coffee. He owns a building downtown, on the corner of 5th and Vance, the one with the private club on the top floor. Callum used to talk about it like it was some big honor to get invited there. I only met Roman once, at the rehearsal dinner. He came uninvited, sat at the end of the table, and talked about family for 20 minutes without ever once smiling. He shook my hand when he left. His hand was warm. I remember thinking that was strange, because everything else about him felt cold. What did he say to you? Exactly, if you can recall it. He said, I hope Callum understands what he's marrying. I thought it was a weird kind of compliment at the time. Now I think it might have been a warning. Adrian's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, like a man recalculating a familiar equation with a new variable. Roman doesn't lend money for interest, he said slowly. Not really. Money is a leash he uses to see who's willing to be owned. The debt was never about $40,000. It was about finding out what Callum would do to survive it. And now, apparently, what you'll do. That's insane. It's business, for men like him. I've met several versions of Roman over the centuries. They rename themselves, change cities, change currencies, but the shape of what they want never changes. Control disguised as commerce. Mara wrapped both hands around her cup, though the coffee had gone lukewarm. So what do I do? I can't pay $40,000. I don't have it, and even if I did, you just told me the money was never really the point. You don't do anything, Adrian said. Not alone. That ends today. You keep saying things like that like it's simple. Like you can just walk into wherever he is and I can, he said. And there was no arrogance in it, just a flat, quiet certainty that made the hair on her arms rise for an entirely different reason than fear. I've been the thing men like Roman are afraid of for longer than his family line has existed. It would take very little effort to make him reconsider his interest in you. That's not how this works. You can't just threaten a man like that and expect him to walk away. People like Roman don't back down. They double down. If you go after him and it doesn't work, he'll come after both of us, and you'll be gone doing whatever it is you do at night, and I'll still be the one standing in a parking garage. Adrian went quiet at that, studying her the way he had the night before, like she'd said something he hadn't expected. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "Threats are a blunt instrument. I prefer, when possible, to be more precise." "Precise how?" "Roman's operation depends on secrecy. His clients, his methods, the people he's leveraged, none of it can survive daylight. If I simply frighten him, he adapts. If I dismantle what he's built, quietly, thoroughly, there's nothing left for him to threaten you with. You make it sound easy. It won't be easy. It will take time, patience, and information I don't currently have." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, in a posture so human it startled her after everything else about him that so plainly wasn't. "Which is why I need you to tell me everything you remember about Callum's dealings with him. Every name, every place, every conversation, no matter how small it seemed at the time." Mara exhaled slowly. "This is going to take a while." "I told you," Adrian said, and for the first time since the car, something like real amusement moved across his face, brief and startling, like sun breaking through cloud cover that had sat over a landscape for centuries. "I have a great deal of time." They spent the next 2 hours at that table, coffee going cold, toast forgotten, while Mara pulled apart 6 months of memory she'd been trying very hard not to look at directly overheard phone calls. An address Callum had mentioned once and never again. A name. Vasquez. That had come up in an argument the week before the wedding that she'd assumed was about wedding vendors, and now suspected was about something much darker. Adrian listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a question so precise it made her realize he'd already built half the picture in his head and was only confirming corners of it. By the time they finished, the fire in the sitting room had burned down to embers, and Mara felt lighter than she had in months, like she'd finally set down something she'd been carrying alone since the day she walked out of that church. "You didn't have to tell me any of that," Adrian said, when she finally fell quiet. "I want you to know I understand what it cost you to say it out loud. You didn't have to stop and listen to all of it either," she said. "Most people would have gotten bored somewhere around minute 40. I'm not most people," he said, quietly, and this time there was no humor in it at all, just something plain and a little raw. An admission dressed up as a joke that hadn't quite landed as one. Mara looked at him for a long moment, cold hands folded on a warm table in a house that shouldn't exist in the middle of a city she thought she knew, and felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. "There's something else," Mara said, before she could talk herself out of it. "The name? Vasquez. I think I know where I've heard it before. My cousin works reception at a law firm downtown, and she mentioned once that one of the partners handles I don't know, shell companies, offshore accounts, that kind of thing. I think his last name was Vasquez. I never thought about it again until just now." Adrian's stillness sharpened into something more focused, the kind of quiet that came before action rather than after it. "A lawyer who launders the paperwork," he said. "That would explain how Roman keeps his operation clean enough to survive audits. Every collector needs someone to make the money disappear on paper. You think my cousin's boss is helping Roman hide money? I think it's worth finding out." He stood, and the movement was so smooth it barely registered as motion, more like a shift in the light. "Would your cousin talk to you? Casually, without alarming her? Maybe, we're close. But if this Vasquez guy is dangerous, I don't want to put her in the middle of it. You wouldn't be. I only need to know which firm, which floor, whether the name matches. Nothing that would draw suspicion to her." Mara pulled out her phone, hands steadier now than they'd been 12 hours ago, and typed out a message to her cousin that looked, on its surface, like idle curiosity about old wedding gossip. The reply came back within minutes. "Oh my God, don't get me started on that guy. He gives me the creeps, works on the 9th floor, does all the boring finance stuff nobody understands." A name followed. It matched. "There," Mara said, showing him the screen. though she suspected he could have read it from across the room if he'd wanted to. Marcus Vasquez. 9th floor. Finance. Good, Adrian said. And there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, an acknowledgement that she'd done something difficult and done it well. That's a thread. Threads unravel things, given the right pull. You're going to go pull it. Eventually. Carefully. Not tonight. He moved toward the window, looking out at the tree line, where the morning light had started to filter gold through the leaves, and she watched him hold himself very deliberately away from the brightening glass, the way she imagined a person might hold themselves away from a fire they weren't sure was safe to stand near. You should rest. Properly, this time. There's a room with better light down the hall if you'd prefer it to the one from last night. You're changing the subject. I am, he agreed without apology. I find I don't want to discuss Roman for the rest of the morning. I'd rather ask you something else, if you'll allow it. Mara felt something in her chest tighten pleasantly, an unfamiliar sensation after months of nothing but dread. Ask, before all this. Before Callum, before the wedding. What did you want? Not what you were running from what you wanted. The question caught her off guard, mostly because no one had asked it in longer than she could remember, not even herself. I wanted to open a bookstore, she said slowly, surprised by how easily it came out, like it had been sitting just under the surface, waiting for someone to finally ask. A small one. Used books, mostly, with a reading corner and bad coffee, and a cat that ignores everyone. I had a whole plan. Then Callum happened, and the wedding happened, and somewhere in there the plan just stopped. Why did it stop? Because it felt frivolous, next to everything else. Wedding planning, his career, his family's expectations. My bookstore became this thing I mentioned at parties and never actually did anything about. That sounds like a poor trade, Adrian said, and there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. Quiet, but unmistakably sharp. Trading a want you'd built for years, for a man who couldn't be bothered to pay his own debts. When you say it like that, it sounds pathetic. It isn't pathetic. It's common. Humans do it constantly, shrink themselves down to fit inside someone else's life, and call it compromise. He turned from the window to look at her fully. I've watched it happen for centuries. It never gets less unfortunate to witness. Mara studied him. This strange, cold, impossibly old creature who'd apparently spent 800 years watching humans make the same mistakes over and over, and felt an unexpected pang of something like tenderness for the loneliness underneath that observation. Have you ever done that? She asked. Shrunk yourself down for someone? Something crossed his face then, brief and old, gone before she could fully name it. Once, he said. A very long time ago. I try not to repeat my own mistakes, even across centuries. It's one of the few advantages of having this much time. You eventually run out of excuses for making the same ones twice. She wanted to ask more, who, when, what had happened, but something in the careful way he'd closed the subject told her it wasn't a door he was ready to open yet, and she found, strangely, that she didn't want to push. Not tonight. Not this morning, technically, though the distinction barely mattered inside a house where the hours seemed to move differently than they did anywhere else. I'll take the room with better light, she said instead, letting him have his silence. But I want breakfast again first. Actual breakfast, not just coffee I forget to drink. Something in his shoulders eased, like he'd been braced for her to press and was relieved she hadn't. I can arrange that. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both seemed to understand. Mara woke late, the exhaustion of fear finally catching up with her in long, dreamless stretches of sleep. Adrian was always awake when she came downstairs, though she never once saw him sleep, and she stopped asking about it after the third morning, deciding some questions were better left to answer themselves over time. They worked through the thread of Vasquez, slowly, carefully, the way Adrian had promised. He made calls she wasn't allowed to listen to, disappeared for an hour here, 2 hours there, and came back each time with another small piece of the picture and account number. A shell company registered in a name that didn't exist. A pattern of transfers that mapped, unmistakably, onto Roman's known properties. "You're good at this," Mara said, on the 4th night, watching him lay out a set of papers on the long table like a general planning a campaign that had already been fought and won 100 times before. "Suspiciously good." "I've had practice," he said. "Men like Roman are not new. Only the paperwork changes. How many Romans have there been? Enough that I've stopped counting individually. I count them by century instead. It's more efficient." He said it lightly, but there was something underneath it, a long exhaustion she was starting to recognize as the particular flavor of tiredness that came from outliving your own patience for cruelty over and over again. "Doesn't it get to you? Watching the same kind of man show up again and again?" "It used to," he admitted. "For the first 100 years or so, I think it broke something in me a little more each time. Eventually, I stopped expecting people to be better and started simply dealing with the ones who weren't. That's a bleak way to survive 8 centuries. It's a practical one." He looked up from the papers, meeting her eyes in a way that felt more deliberate than usual, like he was choosing to say the next part rather than letting it slip out unguarded. "You're the first thing in a very long time that's made me reconsider the bleakness. I wanted you to know that, since you seem to be under the impression I say things without meaning them." Mara felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. "I didn't say that. You implied it. Several times. Something about riddles, I believe, the first night. That was different. That was about the 800 years thing." "Was it?" he said. And there was that flicker of amusement again, quick and startling against the general stillness of him, like watching a statue almost smile. She threw a balled-up napkin at him, mostly to break the moment before it turned into something she wasn't ready to examine too closely, and he caught it without looking, which felt, somehow, entirely unfair. On the 6th day, the quiet broke. Adrian came back from whatever errand had taken him out that afternoon, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the careful stillness of centuries, but something sharper, more immediate, closer to alarm than she'd have thought his face capable of showing. "What happened?" she said, standing up so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. "Denny knows where you are," he said, "or close enough to it. He's been asking questions in the neighborhood near the gate. Roman's patience appears to have run out faster than I anticipated." Mara's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "How close is close enough?" "Close enough that we should assume he'll find the front gate within a day, perhaps 2. Adrian set down the papers he'd been carrying, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something that looked almost like uncertainty cross his face. "I had hoped for more time. Vasquez was close to giving us what we needed. This complicates things. So what do we do?" "We move faster," he said, and the uncertainty vanished, replaced by the same flat, dangerous certainty she'd heard in the car that first night. "And you stay close. Closer than you have been. I won't have Denny finding you in a hallway I've left unwatched. That sounds less like protection and more like a leash," she said, though without much heat behind it, because some small, unguarded part of her had felt a flicker of relief at his alarm, at the plain evidence that her safety mattered to him beyond whatever principle had brought her here in the first place. "Call it what you like," Adrian said. "I intend to keep you breathing. If that requires you to tolerate my company more closely than you'd prefer, I'll accept being called a leash." "I didn't say I'd prefer less of your company," Mara said, and immediately regretted how much that revealed, judging by the way his eyes tracked to hers, and held there a beat too long. "Noted," he said simply, and let the moment pass, though something in his posture had eased, like a held breath finally released. That night, for the first time, he didn't retreat to whatever corner of the house he occupied while she slept. He sat in the chair across from the fire in her room, not speaking, not needing to, just present in a way that made the dark outside the window feel less like a threat and more like something being watched over. She fell asleep to the sound of the fire settling and woke, hours later, to find him exactly where she'd left him, as still as a painting, eyes open, watching the door. "You didn't sleep," she said, voice thick with mourning. "I told you." Not the way you mean." He rose, smoothing down a coat that didn't need smoothing, an old habit from a life that had required such things once. "Denny was seen 2 streets from the gate an hour ago. I've had it reinforced. He won't get through tonight, or the next. But eventually, yes, which is why we finish this quickly." He held out a folder she hadn't seen him carrying before. Vasquez sent this an hour before dawn. He's decided self-preservation outweighs loyalty to Roman. It happens, given the right incentive. What incentive did you use? The honest kind. I told him what happens to men who help people like Roman once people like Roman are no longer useful to protect them. He decided he'd rather be useful to someone who wasn't going to prison. Mara took the folder, flipping through pages of account numbers, property deeds, a spiderweb of shell companies that all led, eventually, back to one name signing every document in a looping, arrogant hand. "This is enough to bury him. It's enough to make him irrelevant," Adrian said. Which, in my experience, frightens men like Roman more than prison ever could. Prison is temporary. Irrelevance is forever. They spent the morning laying out the plan, not a confrontation, not a threat, but something quieter and more permanent. Adrian would deliver the documents to 3 separate parties simultaneously. A federal investigator he'd apparently had dealings with decades before, under a different name. A rival lender who'd wanted Roman's territory for years. And a journalist who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet financial rot. By evening, Roman's carefully built empire would begin collapsing from 3 directions at once, none of which could be traced back to a single woman hiding from a debt collector in a parking garage a week earlier. "He'll know it was me," Mara said, watching Adrian fold the last document into an envelope with hands that moved with unnerving precision. "Or you. Either way, he'll know. He'll suspect. Suspicion without proof is not a threat, not to someone who's already lost everything that gave his suspicion teeth." Adrian sealed the envelope, set it aside. By tomorrow evening, Roman won't have the resources to send Denny after a parking attendant, let alone you. You make it sound so clean. It won't be clean. Very little worth doing ever is. But it will be over, and you'll be able to walk through a parking garage again without listening for footsteps. He looked up at her, something unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there in the car, in the sitting room, in any of the careful conversations that had come before. That matters to me, more than I expected it to, if I'm honest. Mara felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Why does it matter? You've known me a week. You've spent 800 years watching people come and go. Why does one scared woman hiding in your back seat matter this much? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, might retreat back into the careful stillness that had first unsettled her in the car. Instead, he set down the last envelope and crossed the room to stand in front of her, closer than he'd allowed himself to stand before. "Because you didn't scream," he said. In the garage, most people, cornered like that, scream, or freeze, or beg. You ran, and when running wasn't enough, you hid. Quietly, deliberately, and when I asked who was chasing you, you told me the truth instead of a story you thought I wanted to hear. In 800 years, Mara. That is a rarer thing than you'd believe. That's it? I didn't scream? That's the beginning of it, he said, and his voice had dropped into something quieter, rougher at the edges than she'd heard from him before. The rest of it I'm still working out. I find I don't want to work it out quickly. I'd rather take my time, for once, instead of deciding things the way I usually do all at once, out of necessity. Mara didn't move away from him, which surprised her more than anything else that had happened in the last week. That's a very careful way of saying something, she said, for a man who apparently doesn't like taking his time with decisions. I contain multitudes, Adrian said, and the dryness in it startled a laugh out of her, quick and real. The first one that had felt entirely unforced since the wedding that wasn't. You're doing the thing again, she said, where you say something devastating and then undercut it with a joke so I don't have to deal with how devastating it was. Is it working? No, she admitted. It's not working at all. Something in his face shifted then, the careful distance he'd kept even in his closest moments, finally giving way to something plainer, more exposed. He lifted a hand slowly, like he expected her to flinch, like 800 years of caution had taught him to move carefully around anything he wanted to keep, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers cold against her skin in a way that no longer frightened her, only reminded her of exactly what he was and exactly how far he'd come to stand this close to her anyway. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, quieter than she'd ever heard him. Not properly. It's been a very long time since I wanted to. I don't think either of us has to know how to do it properly, Mara said. I left a wedding 6 months ago because I trusted the wrong version of properly for way too long. I'd rather just figure it out. As we go. That's a very human approach to this, he said, though there was no criticism in it, only something like wonder. I am in fact very human, she said. It's kind of my whole thing. I've noticed, he said, and the words carried more weight than the joke deserved, an admission underneath the humor that he'd noticed everything about her, every gesture, every unguarded moment, cataloging her the way she'd been cataloging him since the first night in the car. He kissed her then. Careful and slow, cold lips against warm ones in a contrast that should have felt wrong, and instead felt like the exact shape of everything that had happened since the parking garage, two people from entirely different worlds, entirely different centuries, finding some unlikely equilibrium between fear and safety, between the debt she'd been running from and the version of herself she was only now starting to remember she wanted to be. When they broke apart, she pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the absolute stillness where a heartbeat should have been, and found that she didn't mind it. Not anymore. No pulse, she said, half to herself. No pulse, he agreed, but I promise you, Mara, everything else in me is entirely alive when you're in the room. The documents went out that evening, exactly as planned, delivered by 3 separate hands to 3 separate destinations, and by the following morning the first reports had already surfaced a federal inquiry opened into a downtown lending operation. A rival's men suddenly occupying territory that had belonged to someone else the day before, a journalist's byline breaking a story about shell companies and quiet financial ruin that would take weeks to fully unravel in print. Denny never came back to the gate. Word filtered through. Days later, through channels Adrian didn't fully explain, that he'd left the city entirely, along with most of what remained of Roman's operation, scattering like smoke the moment the structure holding it together had cracked. Mara stood at the window of the house that had stopped feeling like a stranger's a week ago, watching morning light spill gold over the tree line, and felt, for the first time in 6 months, something like the absence of fear, not relief exactly, but the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of a debt finally, fully paid, by someone else's hand, freely given. You're thinking very loudly, Adrian said, from the doorway, where he'd learned over the past week, to stand just outside the reach of the morning light. "I'm thinking about bookstores," she said, turning to look at him. "The one I never opened. I think I want to try again." "I think," Adrian said, crossing the room to stand beside her, careful, as always, to keep himself in the shade that you should. "And I think, if you'll allow it, I'd like to be there when you do. Even in daylight? Even with all the boring parts, ordering inventory, dealing with a leaky roof, all the parts that have nothing to do with debts or vampires or 800 years of practice at being terrifying? Especially those parts," he said, and there was no performance in it at all, just a plain, quiet honesty that had taken him a week and 8 centuries to finally offer without hiding behind a joke. "I find I've had quite enough of terrifying. I'd like, for once, to try something ordinary. If you'll have me." Mara took his cold hand in her warm one, lacing their fingers together in the gold morning light neither of them had expected to still be standing in, together, when the debt was finally, completely paid. "I'll have you," she said. Ordinary, and all. 3 weeks passed before the first sign of trouble surfaced again, and when it did, it came from a direction neither of them had thought to watch. Mara had started spending her mornings at a narrow storefront on Delancey Street, empty for 2 years, its windows soaped over and its for lease sign faded to the color of old newspaper. She'd stand outside it before the shop across the street opened, imagining shelves where the soap streaks were, a reading corner in the far back where the light came in low through a window that faced east. Adrian usually came with her, standing just inside the awning's shade, offering opinions on paint colors he had no real stake in, and pretending not to notice how much it meant to her that he showed up anyway. It was on one of those mornings that Mara's cousin called, voice tight in a way that made her stomach drop before a single word had been said. "Marcus Vasquez didn't just quit the firm," her cousin said. "He's gone. Like, actually gone. Nobody's heard from him in 4 days. HR's been weird about it, won't say anything, and there's a rumor going around that 2 men came asking for him last week. Big guys. Not clients." Mara's hand tightened on the phone. "Did anyone get names?" "No. But Mara, I heard one of the partners mention someone named Roman. I don't know if it's the same Roman you told me about, but you said his name once, back before the wedding stuff, and I never forgot it because it sounded like a mob movie." She hung up and turned to find Adrian already watching her, his stillness sharpened into that particular alertness she'd come to recognize as danger translated into patience. "Vasquez is missing," she said. 4 days. 2 men came asking for him at the firm before that. Roman's operation was gutted, not destroyed, Adrian said slowly, working through it the way he worked through everything. Methodical even under pressure. "I assumed the federal inquiry and the loss of his territory would occupy what remained of his resources. I may have underestimated how much a man like that values retribution over self-preservation. You think he's going after Vasquez because he sold him out? I think that's the most likely explanation, yes. And I think, if that's true, we should assume Roman has concluded, correctly, that Vasquez wasn't the only one who turned on him." His jaw tightened, the first genuinely rattled expression she'd seen on him since the night Denny had gotten close to the gate. "Which means he may have concluded the same about you. I thought this was over." "So did I," Adrian admitted, and there was something almost apologetic in it. An old creature unused to being wrong about the shape of a threat, unsettled by the discovery that he still could be. "I should have anticipated a wounded animal doesn't simply retreat. Sometimes it turns and bites the nearest thing to it, out of spite alone. They didn't go back to the house that had become theirs in the week since the parking garage. Instead, Adrian took her to a second property she hadn't known existed, smaller, unmarked, tucked behind a bookshop 2 streets from where Mara had been dreaming of shelves that didn't exist, yet an irony neither of them commented on, but both clearly noticed. "How many houses do you own?" Mara asked, only half joking, as he checked the locks on a door that looked ordinary and was, she suspected, anything but. Enough that Roman won't find this one easily, he said. 800 years teaches a person to never keep all their safety in one place. That's a very practical way to live. It's the only way I know how to. He turned to her, and some of the sharpness in his expression softened, though it didn't disappear. I'm sorry. I told you this would be over. I should have been more careful before making that promise. You didn't lie to me, Mara said. You made a mistake. Those aren't the same thing. She reached for his hand, the cold of it no longer a surprise, only a fact she'd folded into the growing list of facts that made up loving him. What do we do now? Now, Adrian said, we find out exactly how wounded Roman actually is, and whether he still has enough teeth left to be worth worrying about, or whether this is simply the last, desperate gesture of a man watching everything he built come apart. He was gone within the hour, moving through channels she still didn't fully understand, leaving her in the unmarked house with instructions not to open the door for anyone, not even someone who claimed to know him. She spent the wait pacing, then sitting, then finally pulling a battered paperback off a shelf that had clearly been arranged for exactly this purpose, and made herself read 3 chapters of a mystery novel she couldn't have summarized 5 minutes after finishing it. He returned near midnight, and the moment he stepped through the door she knew, from the set of his shoulders, that whatever he'd found wasn't good. Vasquez is dead, he said, without preamble, because she'd told him once she preferred that to being softened toward bad news. Roman found him 2 days ago. It wasn't quick. Mara's stomach turned over. That's my fault. It is not, Adrian said, sharp enough that she blinked. Vasquez made a choice to help us, knowing the risk. Roman made a choice to be the kind of man who punishes disloyalty with cruelty. You made the choice, 6 months ago, to leave a wedding rather than marry a man who'd already betrayed you. None of those choices belonged to you except the last one. And it was the right one. Doesn't make it feel better. No, he agreed. It doesn't. Grief rarely listens to logic. But I won't let you carry guilt that isn't yours, Mara. Not while I'm capable of stopping it. So what happens now? She asked, wrapping her arms around herself despite the fact that the house wasn't cold. Not really, only quiet in the particular way that followed bad news. Does Roman come after me next? He'll try, Adrian said, but I don't think he has much left to try with. What I found tonight tells me his organization is smaller than it was 3 weeks ago, by more than half. The federal inquiry has frozen most of his remaining assets. The rival lender has taken 2 of his properties outright. Vasquez was, I think, less a strategic move and more a last act of spite from a man who knows he's losing and wants someone to bleed for it before the end. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be honest. You asked me not to soften things, and I'm holding to that. He crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that his cold radiated gently against her side, a sensation she'd stopped flinching from weeks ago. But I think, Mara, that a man with half an organization, frozen assets, and 1 act of desperate cruelty behind him is not a man planning a long campaign. He's a man trying to feel powerful one last time before it's over completely. How do we make sure it's actually over? We finish what we started. Quietly, completely, this time without underestimating him. Adrian's jaw set in that particular way that told her he'd already begun building the shape of a plan. Methodical, patient, the way 8 centuries of practice had taught him to be. I'll need 3 days. Perhaps 4. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you stay here, and you let me be overly cautious about it, even if it feels excessive. She didn't argue. Something in her, the same something that had once told her to run instead of scream in that parking garage, told her this wasn't the moment to push back on caution, The 3 days passed slowly, marked by Adrian's absences and returns, each one bringing another piece of information that painted the same picture with increasing clarity. Roman's empire wasn't just wounded, it was actively dying, collapsing under the weight of federal attention and rival opportunism that Adrian's original documents had set into motion weeks before. The man himself, according to whispers Adrian gathered from sources Mara didn't ask too many questions about, had grown erratic, paranoid, the kind of desperate that made men dangerous in small, unpredictable ways, rather than large, calculated ones. On the 4th night, Adrian came back changed, not injured, not visibly, but carrying himself with the particular stillness of someone who'd just finished something difficult and wasn't yet ready to talk about the shape of it. "It's done," he said simply, sitting across from her the way he had that very first morning after the parking garage, elbows on his knees, the posture that always meant he was choosing his next words with unusual care. "Roman? Arrested 2 hours ago. Federal agents, acting on evidence that had apparently been quietly accumulating for weeks, moved on him tonight, in the middle of what remained of his own club. He won't be making bail. The evidence against him now includes considerably more than shell companies and unpaid debts." "What else is there?" Adrian's expression flickered, something old and grim passing behind his eyes, enough to keep him from ever threatening anyone again. "I'll spare you the details. Some things are better left unexamined, even by someone who insists on honesty." Mara studied him for a long moment, understanding, without needing it spelled out, that whatever Adrian had done in those final days to ensure Roman's fall was complete, it had cost him something to do it, some piece of the careful restraint he'd built over centuries specifically to avoid becoming the kind of creature his nature made easy to become. "Are you okay?" she asked, and watched surprise flicker across his face, like the question itself was unfamiliar, like no one had asked him that in longer than she could imagine. "I will be," he said. "It's easier, this time knowing there's a reason to be, knowing there's someone waiting for the answer." She moved to sit beside him, taking his cold hand in both of hers, and felt him exhale, not from any physical need for breath, she understood by now, but from something more like relief, a tension releasing that had nothing to do with lungs and everything to do with finally, after 800 years, having somewhere safe to set down a weight he'd carried alone for far too long. "It's over," she said, testing the words, letting herself believe them for the first time since the parking garage. "It's over," Adrian agreed. "Roman is finished. Denny is gone. Whatever remains of that world no longer has any claim on you." He turned his hand over in hers, lacing their fingers together, cold and warm exactly as they'd been that first morning in the gold light. "The debt is paid, Mara. All of it. You don't owe anyone anything anymore." 2 months later, the storefront on Delancey Street had shelves. Mara stood in the middle of the space that had once been soaped over windows and a faded for lease sign, surrounded by boxes of second-hand books she'd spent weeks sourcing from estate sales and library discards, and one particularly generous donation from a retired English professor who decided her enthusiasm reminded him of his younger self. The reading corner she'd imagined against the east-facing window had become real 2 mismatched armchairs, a low table, a rug that didn't match anything else in the shop and somehow made the whole place feel more like itself because of it. "You've moved the poetry section 3 times this week," Adrian said from the doorway, where the afternoon light stopped just short of where he stood, a habit so ingrained now she barely noticed him managing it anymore. "It wasn't right the first 2 times. It wasn't right because you keep second-guessing yourself, not because the shelf was wrong. When did you become an expert on bookshop feng shui? I've had 2 months of watching you rearrange the same 4 shelves," he said, and there was warmth in it now, Easy in a way his voice hadn't been in the car that first night, back when every word had felt measured, weighed, released only after careful consideration. I've become something of an expert, by necessity. She laughed and crossed the room to him, close enough to feel the familiar cool radiating off him, even through the afternoon warmth of the shop. Come help me unpack the last box, then, expert. I don't have hands built for delicate paperbacks. You have hands built for holding a siege ladder full of nothing. I think a box of used mysteries is within your capabilities. Something flickered across his face, an old joke she didn't fully understand yet, a reference to some story from centuries past that he'd clearly find amusing to explain eventually, on some slow afternoon when the shop was quiet and the light was soft enough for him to sit near the window without discomfort. They'd found a rhythm in the 2 months since Roman's arrest. Since Vasquez's death had settled into a grief Mara still carried, but no longer carried alone. Since the last loose threads of that terrifying night in the parking garage had finally been tied off for good. Adrian split his time between whatever obligations came with being 800 years old and apparently still owed to some counsel or arrangement he'd only half explained. And the quiet. Ordinary hours of helping Mara build something entirely her own, something that had nothing to do with debts or fear or the life she'd nearly married into. I've been thinking, Mara said, kneeling beside the last box, pulling out a stack of water-damaged paperbacks that had somehow survived 3 different used bookstores before landing here. About names. For the shop. You've had a name for weeks. You've mentioned it at least 6 times. I know, but I keep second-guessing it. Same as the poetry shelf. What was it again? Threadbare, she said. Because everything in here is a little worn, a little second-hand, but still worth keeping. Still worth reading. She looked up at him, feeling suddenly shy in a way that surprised her, given everything they'd survived together already. I was going to put a little plaque by the door. Something about how things don't stop being useful just because someone's finished with them. Adrian went very still, in the particular way she'd learned meant something had landed somewhere deep and unexpected, rather than simply catching him off guard. That's a good line, he said, quietly. Where's it from? You. Actually. Sort of, something you said, that first week, about not minding being worn down, I guess. Used by centuries instead of thrown away by them. She shrugged, suddenly uncertain. It's probably too on the nose. It's not too on the nose, he said, crossing the small distance between them and crouching down beside her, careful with the water-damaged paperbacks, in a way that betrayed how much practice he'd put in to learning to be gentle with fragile human things. I think it might be the truest thing anyone's ever said about me, actually. I just didn't expect to hear it back. She reached out and touched his face, the cold familiar now, comforting in the specific way that only came from choosing something fully, eyes open, after nearly losing it in a parking garage on a night that had started as the worst of her life and ended, somehow, as the beginning of the best of it. I love you, she said, simply, because there didn't seem to be a reason left to hold it back. Not after everything. Not after Roman and Denny and Vasquez, and 800 years of loneliness finally interrupted by one scared woman who hadn't screamed when she should have. I love you, Adrian said back, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice carried no careful distance at all, no centuries of restraint holding the words at arm's length, just the plain, unguarded truth of a man who'd finally, after 800 years, found something worth staying warm for. Outside, the afternoon light kept climbing higher, and Adrian stayed exactly where he was, in the shade by her side, unwilling, for once, to let even the sun move him from where he wanted to be. The last box unpacked itself slower than either of them expected, mostly because Adrian kept stopping to read the backs of books he had no intention of buying, turning them over with the same careful curiosity He'd once shown a one-eyed ceramic owl. If she'd known to compare the two, a story from another life entirely. One she'd hear eventually, on some slow afternoon much further down the road than this one. "You're stalling," Mara said, nudging his shoulder with hers. "I'm cataloging," he corrected. "There's a difference." "There isn't. Actually, there is, if I insist hard enough." She smiled and went back to shelving, and for a long while neither of them spoke, comfortable in the particular quiet that had grown between them over 2 months of ordinary afternoons, a quiet that had nothing to do with fear anymore, and everything to do with two people who no longer needed to fill every silence to know exactly where they stood with each other. The bell over the door rang sometime near closing, and Mara looked up to see her cousin standing in the doorway, grinning at the state of the shop, at the half-built shelves and the mismatched armchairs, and the man crouched on the floor beside her cousin, examining a paperback with the seriousness of a scholar handling an ancient manuscript. "It's really happening," her cousin said, stepping inside, looking around at everything Mara had built in the 2 months since the debt had finally been paid in full. "The actual bookstore. I didn't believe you when you texted me about it back in the spring." "Neither did I, honestly," Mara admitted, standing, brushing dust off her knees. "Feels different, doing it this time. Like it's actually mine." "It is actually yours," Adrian said from the floor, not looking up from the paperback. "I've contributed nothing but opinions on shelf placement, and an unreasonable number of arguments about the poetry section. You helped source half these books," Mara said. "I made calls. You did the actual work of building something out of nothing." He finally looked up, and something in his expression, steady and warm despite the cold that would never entirely leave him, made her chest tighten in the good way, the way she'd started to associate with him specifically, and no one else, ever again. "I only get to stand nearby and watch." "That's not nothing," Mara said. "Standing nearby, on purpose, when you don't have to. That's the whole thing, actually." Her cousin looked between them with the particular expression of someone slowly putting together a picture she'd only half understood from a distance, then decided, wisely, not to ask any of the questions clearly forming behind her eyes. "I'm going to go look at the mystery section," she announced instead, "and pretend I didn't just walk in on something private." She wandered off toward the shelves, and Mara turned back to Adrian, who was still holding the paperback like it mattered more than it possibly could. 800 years, she said quietly, so only he could hear it. "And you chose to spend an afternoon on the floor of a used bookstore, arguing about poetry shelves. I would spend 800 more the same way, if you'd let me," Adrian said. And there was no performance left in it at all. Just the plain, quiet truth of a man who'd spent centuries convinced that loneliness was simply the cost of surviving, and had finally, in a parking garage on an ordinary Tuesday night, discovered he'd been wrong. Mara knelt back down beside him, took the paperback out of his hands, and set it gently on the nearest shelf, in a spot she'd probably rearrange 3 more times before the week was out. "Then stay," she said, "for all of it, the boring parts and the terrifying parts and everything in between." "I intend to," Adrian said. And outside, the last of the daylight slid gold across the window of a shop called Threadbare, built by a woman who'd once hidden on the floor of a stranger's car to escape one kind of danger, and found, instead, 800 years of quiet devotion, waiting patiently in the front seat, cold hands and all, ready at last to stay.